Hello and welcome to part 5 of my workflow walkthrough. If you haven't seen parts 1 to 4 yet, I urge you to go back and watch those first so that this stage makes sense and you aren't missing out on any of the tips and tricks that I've already shown. So let's dive in. In this part we're going to cover the sexy topic of colour grading. We'll look at the Lumetri panel using masks and using keyframes with the colour grade too. Now we can dive into what for most people is probably the sexiest part of video editing, and that is colour correction and colour grading. Now, setting up the sequence settings correctly, noise reduction, some of the other elements are extremely important to getting a good quality video output, but colour grading and colour correcting gives you the most visual satisfaction. So let's dive in. We come down to the effects window and search for Lumetri Color, drag it onto the clip. Now there's a few key things to remember with Lumetri Color. You've got all these different panels down the side, but you don't necessarily want to use them in the order that they're shown. The other thing to remember is that under the basic correction, these are quite coarse adjustments rather than fine tuning. Within the lower panels you get a lot more fine tuning, so it'll all depend as to what depth you want to go to. At first, start at the top and start working your way down. This isn't going to be a deep dive into colour grading and colour correcting. I'll do a separate video for that because that's quite a long topic on its own. In here I'm going to cover some of the basics. So another thing to remember is, especially with drone footage, we've generally got two different areas of exposure of dynamic range. We've got a sky, which is usually quite bright, and a ground, which is usually darker. If you just drag on Lumetri Color and start adjusting things willy-nilly, then you're affecting the whole image. What I'm going to show you in this video is using masking so that you can have one set of corrections on the sky and another set of corrections on the ground. We can achieve this by dragging multiple instances of Lumetri Color onto the footage. You're not restricted to just having one instance of Lumetri Color, but for now I'll clear those. So as I say, I'm not going to go into too much depth in this video, but what I am going to do is introduce the principles of using masking and multiple instances of Lumetri Color to affect different areas of the image. To start with, I'm going to deal with the sky. So I'm going to mask this out. Now, one trick that I use is if you come down here and zoom out on the image, it's just temporarily, this isn't affecting the output of the image, it's just giving you more workspace. We've got a fairly straight horizon here, so I'll just go for a straight polygon mask. Now, when we come to animating the masks, if you make it the exact size of the image, you're going to be creating a lot of work, because as the image moves, you're going to have to keep moving all these points. So that's why I zoom out to 25%, and then I make the mask far bigger than I think it needs to be. And what this means is, as that image pans left and right and up and down, those parts of the masks I'm not going to have to keep adjusting. Go back to fitting the image to size, and then you want to start feathering the mask, and quite a lot of feather. In most instances, it's very rare I'll use a small feather on the mask, because otherwise the differences between the sky and the ground editing become obvious. We'll set that for now. You can always come back and change that, and I'll just adjust that mask. I want the feather to probably stop there, and I'll just straighten the mask up, going back out to 25%, and I'll pull that down to get it level. I can play around with exactly where that's sitting as I add effects. So first thing I want to do with the sky is I want to accentuate the transition from pre-sunrise to post-sunrise. So I'm going to darken down that sky a little bit. So I'll take the shadows of the sky and drag those down. I think about there will do. And now we're going to come back to keyframing again. I'm going to start at the start of the video with the sky darkened and help to brighten it and adjust it as it goes through. So for now I'm at the start of the sequence and I've set a keyframe at -69 for shadows. The next thing I'll adjust is probably the temperature. I want to add a bit more of a sunrisey look to this. So I'll probably take that up to about there. Click the stopwatch icon. Once that's in blue, it means every time you change a figure, it'll set a new keyframe. I'll play around with tint a little bit. Add a bit of magenta into there. That'll do. Again, set the keyframe. Bring the highlights down. That's it, and we're getting it to look a bit more like a pre-sunrise sky, whereas before it was quite bright. Stopwatch icon yet again. Now, as I say, I'm not going to go into all of the panels in this tutorial, partly because this footage doesn't really need it. I'll pick a more suitable piece of footage for explaining every single panel and every single effect. But I'll add a bit of vibrance. I prefer vibrance to saturation because saturation affects all of the colours in the image. Vibrance tends to affect the saturation of the mid-tones or the less saturated colours, so it's a bit more subtle of an effect. One thing that I often do when adjusting figures is take them all the way to one extreme and all the way to the other, and that helps you to kind of find where by eye you like the image. These are quite useful tools. Swing it round wildly to see the effect. I think I'm going to add a little bit of magenta into the shadows, and in the highlights I'll go for a little bit of orangey yellow. So stopwatch icon. Remember, if you want the effect to stay the same throughout the whole footage, which you would do on most footage, you don't need to use keyframes, but if you want the effect to change over time, you need to use these keyframes. If you're just changing a figure, that doesn't automatically add any keyframes. If you want it to stay the same, just change it. If you want it to change over time, you need a keyframe. Problem with colour grading is the more that you stare at an image, the more you think, oh yeah, that looks fine, when you might have overdone it. One thing that's useful is if you come up to the FX icon next to the Lumetri Color, you can turn the effect on and off to see what you've done. What that also shows at this point is that we're only affecting the sky and not the ground. If we come to the end of the footage, we haven't set any more keyframes, so we've still got exactly the same effects we set to the start. Probably shows better that it's not affecting the ground other than here, where you can see our mask has moved, and we're going to deal with that in a moment. So if I go back to the start of the footage, as I scrub through the footage here, you can see that mask isn't staying where we want it to be. There's two ways of trying to deal with that. One is the automatic method, which we'll do first. If that doesn't work, then you can do it manually. So to try and track that, click on the mask, and then there we've got track a selected mask forward. If we click on that, Premiere Pro will attempt to keep that in the same position on the picture. Now, as we can see, Premiere Pro has set a whole load of keyframes. Looks like a line, but that's just a whole series of keyframes for where it thinks the position needs to be, and it's not done a great job. Let's drag back through it. No, it's not done a brilliant job at all. In a lot of cases, especially if I'd taken the time to mask perfectly around the horizon, it probably would have done a better job. In a lot of cases it will work. In this case it hasn't, so I can get rid of all those key points by unchecking mask path stopwatch, and that says it'll delete all the keyframes. There we go, they're gone. The alternative way of doing it, which will work fairly easily in this case because the movement is smooth, is I'll start the stopwatch so that the mask is keyframed at the start of the footage, and I'll go to the end of the footage, which another keyboard shortcut. If you press up arrow on the keyboard, it'll go to the cut in your footage to the left. If you press down arrow on the keyboard, it goes to the end of that clip. Left arrow on the keyboard will go one frame at a time left. Right arrow on the keyboard goes one frame at a time to the right. So I'll go to the end of here. I'm at the very last frame, and this is why if I'd made the mask the exact size of the screen, the top would have come down into here and I'd have to be altering different things, but here I can just drag that up like that and it's set a keyframe at the end. So what it's going to do is smoothly move from the start position to the end. Now I need to check whether that's suitable for this footage or not. If I go to the middle of the clip, that's looking okay. Because I'd put a smooth, consistent pan in, I've been able to keyframe the movement of the mask as a smooth, consistent move, and it stayed how I want. That covers keyframing and manual adjustment of the mask. If I'd found when I went to the middle it had jumped, I could move the mask to where it needs to be, and it adds another keyframe, so it'll move smoothly from the start to the middle and then from the middle to the end. In this example the footage moved smoothly and I only needed 2 keyframes. You may find in a lot of examples you have to set 1 keyframe at the start, 1 keyframe at the end, then go to the middle, adjust it, which I'll put another keyframe in, then go halfway in between there and halfway in between there, you know, and keep setting key points in increments until you get a smooth movement that follows the line you want. But I don't need that, so if I left click, use the marquee tool to highlight that key point and then press delete, that's gone. Now that we've colour graded the sky and animated the mask from start to finish, we'll just switch our workflow from the editing workflow to the colour workflow. Now what that does is brings up the Lumetri Scopes and keeps the Lumetri panel on the right hand side. The Lumetri Scopes are an extremely powerful tool, but there's a lot of caveats to the use. If you click on the spanner icon, you can choose which scopes that you use. I use the YUV vector scope, which is this one, the histogram, which is this one, the Rgb Parade, which is this one, and the Luma waveform. This is 8-bit footage that I'm processing. If you've got 10-bit floating point or HDR footage, you can change that. But for DJI Mini 2 footage, it's 8-bit. So as a quick description of these, the Rgb Parade is effectively showing you the colour balance in the image. Now I have pushed this image to be a lot warmer than it should be, but this is an example where a lot of people insist that you must get your red, green and blue channels equal, and in this case that wouldn't work. I'll show you what happens if I try and equalize those parades. So if I equalize them, which theoretically is the correct thing to do, that's the image that I get, which fair enough, but what I'm looking for is an image that I like the look of, which is why trying to get these equal isn't always the right thing to do, depending what the subject matter is. For example, if you've got a picture that's mostly blue sky and blue sea, the blue levels are going to be higher than the others. It's just how the image is. And this is where I found when I was learning video editing a lot of misadvice on YouTube, where people insist you must get these equal, and that isn't the case. These are useful tools, but I think that your eyes are an extremely useful tool, and that's how I tend to do most of it. The RGB can be useful, but it's not a holy grail. Lumoscope, on the other hand, is quite useful. But again, there's no strict rules that can be applied to using it, other than anything above 100 means you're clipping the whites and losing information. So if I move exposure up, we can see we're hitting a ceiling here, and that's all clipped. When that gets into the solid line, that is all clipped. Now, it's hard to apply rules to using the Lumoscope, because if your image doesn't have bright areas of sky, then you don't want to be pushing it up to 90 to 100. Similarly, if there's no black areas in the picture, you don't want to be spreading it down to 0. So it's useful to show you the range of brightness that you've got in your image. But again, you need to be looking at that in conjunction with looking at the actual image to see what's best. Having said that, I do tend to try and keep the whites down to about 95, not going all the way up to 100. And depending on the image, not right down to 0 with the blacks, but maybe going to 5 or not even any lower than 10. It's a case of adjusting the exposure, shadows, whites and blacks in conjunction with this, but also in conjunction with how your image looks. The vector scope gives you an idea of where the colours in the image are sitting. Now, that line that goes up and down there is the skin line, which obviously there's no skin in this image, so that's not really relevant, but it gives you an idea of that we've got a lot of reds spread across to yellows in this, very little in the way of blues, greens, etc. That's useful if you want to start doing a colour grade where you've got a lot of red and cyan. You can start to adjust the colour settings to get these colours where you want them to be. The histogram effectively shows the data from black at 0 to white at 255, and how the colour balance, the RGB, is split between those different brightness levels. Out of all the scopes, I'd say I use the Luma waveform the most, with a reference to the Rgb Parade and the histogram, and also a reference if I'm trying to manipulate the colours to get a certain colour scheme, I'll use the vector scope, but primarily the Luma Parade. So now I'll move on to colour grading the end of the sequence. So I'll move to the end. So we'll switch back to the effect controls for the minute so we can see keyframes, and turn the Lumetri Scopes off. They're there so that we can go back to them. If you can't see them when you're editing, then you go to Window, and you can choose your Lumetri Scopes here. And the Lumetri Color brings up the Lumetri panel. But what I want to be seeing at this point is the keyframe. Now, if you remember at the start of the video, when we set our colour grading, it set keyframes. So when we come to the end, we're going to adjust this to how we like. Then it will do a smooth transition from the colour grade at the start to a completely different colour grade at the end of the video. So working through the panel, the sun's now risen. So I want to bring the temperature down, probably looking at it by eye to about there. I don't want the magenta tint in the image anymore. Let me double click on the dot. It returns it to 0. One little tip is, if you're ever adjusting any of these sliders and you decide that moving it all the way to the side hasn't given you enough, then quite often clicking in the end on the blue number in effect makes your virtual slider go further. That only goes up to 5. If I click in there and drag to the right, I can move it up to 7. If for any reason you ever needed further adjustment, you could bring another instance of Lumetri on and then move the slider up on that instance, and you're in effect doubling up the adjustment then. But it's very rare you'll run out of latitude on these sliders. So, slight digression there, apologise. So we've adjusted the temperature and the tint. Let's have a look at the shadows now. We darken the sky. Again, I'm wanting to move this to more of a the sun's already risen look. So I want to bring the shadows up, probably to about there. Highlights, it's already a really blown out image, so I don't really want to bring the highlights up. And I think the colour, I don't think it needs any more vibrant. If anything, maybe a bit more blue into there. A lot of this is trial and error. Unfortunately, there's no mathematical formula to tell you how to do colour grading. It's really using your eyes, moving the sliders and seeing how it affects the image. I want the sky a little bit bluer and a less yellowy, but I don't want to move the temperature because it gives an unrealistic colour cast to the image. But we'll work around that through the other panels. As I say, the basic panel is very broad. The nitty-gritty is in the lower panels. If I don't think I want to reduce the vibrance at all, but I will change the shadow tint. As you see, the shadows, we put purple in earlier because it was pre-sunrise. Now the sun's risen, I probably want to be changing that to more of a blue colour or an aqua. That looks better. Same with the highlight tints. We had that at a pre-sunrise amber. Now I want to move it to where it's more of a post-sunrise look. So I think I'm pleased with that. If we switch between pre-sunrise, post-sunrise, we've got a completely different look to the sky. One thing I think I'll move on, this is quite a useful tone. These wheels within colour wheels and match, primarily they're here to add a colour tint to shadows, midtones and highlight. However, these do also affect the luminance of shadows, midtones and highlights, which gives you a little bit more fine control than the controls we had in basic correction. So I think I'm going to take advantage of this and set a stopwatch icon there. I've just brought shadows down a little bit, midtones bring down a little bit, highlights I'll bring down. And again, now that we've set the keyframe at the start, you can see here where we've adjusted the finishing settings, it's automatically put keyframes in. I'll go back to the end of the footage and adjust shadows, midtones and highlights to taste. Crank those shadows up a little bit. Midtones, I like those about there. If you drag the highlights down too far, you just get a very washed out, muddy look to the image. Whilst we try not to blow out highlights in footage, just sunrise or sunset image, it's difficult to adjust blown out highlights. So I think I like those there. So now if we scrub through, we'll see that what we've done is one colour grade at the start, one colour grade at the end, but we've got to transition smoothly between the two. It's pretty clever stuff when I first discovered it. Now, if your transition wasn't smooth from start to finish, then a bit like adjusting the mask, you could go to the middle of the sequence and tweak the settings to how they should be at that point. So you'll then, in effect, have two transitions, one from the start to the mid and one from the mid to the end, and so on. Normally when we're grading footage, we're dealing with short clips, so there shouldn't be too much messing about required. Right, moving on. So to recap, what we've done so far is apply a mask so that our colour grade will only apply to the sky, and then applied a graduated colour grade from the start to the end of the clip. What we now need to do is colour grade the ground. What we'll do is right click on the Lumetri Colour that we've used for the sky, right click on it, and you have this option for rename. So to avoid confusion, we're going to call that sky. And as you can see, it's now named that, so we don't get confused what it's for. Now the mask we've applied for the sky, we can now use that for the ground by very simply right click and copy on Lumetri Colour. Clicking on the little arrow expands and closes it down, and then we'll right click and paste. What we've got now is a duplicate copy of the sky corrections. I'm going to right click and rename that to ground, and what we can do is click on the mask and click invert, and what that has in effect done is, instead of masking the sky to the horizon, we're now masking the horizon down. What I will do though is, when we mask the sky, I've had it fading out just above the horizon. Now that we're masking the ground, I want it to fade out just below the horizon. So I'll move the starting mask point to there, scrub to the end, and move the finishing mask point to the same place. And as we scrub through, we can see when we dealt with the sky, we made sure the mask stayed in the right place. So now when we use it for the ground, it will stay in the right place. What we can do is click on Reset Effect. That's left us with the mask, but it's cleared out every change that was made, but it hasn't got rid of keyframes, so we need to manually do that. If we turn that on and off, it's having no effect on the ground whatsoever. So we're ready to go with our colour grading for the ground. Now at the start of the clip, the ground is dark, and that's how I want it to stay, so there's not a lot I'm going to change on the ground. What I probably will do is I'm going to change temperature and tint, so I'll set stopwatch icons for those. I don't know how well this will show in the video, but if you drag temperature right down into the negative, it adds a kind of bluey night effect to the ground, a sort of dusky, almost a foggy look. Tint, Yeah, I think I'll move the tint up slightly into the magenta to enhance that kind of dark, foggy look. So that's automatically set keyframes. Now at any point when we move, if we adjust any of these, it automatically sets another keyframe, which I'll delete that because I don't want it there. So I'll carry on the adjustment for temperature at the end of the video. Now, as soon as I move that, you see a keyframe appeared. And I want the ground to go from that nighttime bluey look to a little bit of a warm look. I think about there. Looks good to me. Now that this is becoming fully lit, I don't really want a magenta or green tint to the footage. I'll take that to 0, but if you play around with it, maybe a little bit of green. Yeah, I think I like that. Colour grading is an art more than a science. It's a matter of adjusting each individual scene to your taste. It's difficult to come up with a fixed formula or set of rules of how to do it. It's adjusting the sliders to see what looks nice. So on the ground, I think the only other things I'm probably going to change from start to finish, I'll come back and I'll go down to the colour wheels that you remember earlier I said these are quite useful for adjusting shadows, midtones and highlights separately. At the start, I don't think I want to make this any brighter or any darker. I will need to set keyframes so that at the start of the footage, those are set to no adjustment. And then I'll come through to the end, see if I want to brighten or darken any of this up at all. I might enhance the brightness a little bit, just to exaggerate the day to night transition. So again, whenever you're colour grading, it's useful to go in and click the FX icon to turn the effect on and off. See, before, after, before, after, before, after. So I've brightened this up to enhance the transition from day to night. If you go back to the start, turn the ground effect on and off, all that's really been done there is to add that bluey night look to it. So then if we scrape through the timeline, you can see that as we go, that bluey look to the ground disappears and we get the daylight look at the end. So if we play that through, you can see what we've done. So what we've dealt with in this video is using multiple instances of Lumetri Color to apply to different parts of the image, using masks to limit the effect of those Lumetri instances, animating those masks, and using keyframes both for the mask and on the color grade. And that, I feel, gives a much better result than slapping Lumetri Color on and changing the whole image. Now, you won't always want to have a change in your color grade throughout the footage, but even on normal drone clips, you're going to want to mask the sky and the ground separately in most, if not all, cases. There may even be other parts of the image where you want to apply masks, and you could have as many instances of Lumetri Color and as many masks as you want to get the result that you're after. So I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next part, which is sound design. Thank you for watching.